In 1939, Britain ruled the largest empire in human history. It controlled a quarter of the world's land and a quarter of the world's population. The pound sterling was the undisputed king of currency, and the Royal Navy dominated every ocean on the map. Britain was the unquestioned superpower. Yet, just 17 years later, in 1956, Britain was begging the United States for permission to protect its own strategic interests. By 1967, the pound had collapsed. By 1976, Britain was standing hat in hand before the International Monetary Fund, asking for a bailout, utterly humiliated. The empire that had ruled the world for 2 centuries became a secondary European power in less than 3 decades. History books will tell you Britain lost its empire because of independence movements, moral progress, and the end of colonialism. And while that is partially true, it is not the real story. The brutal truth is that Britain lost its empire because it went bankrupt. Not morally bankrupt, financially bankrupt. Britain lost World War II economically, even though it won militarily. Over the next 20 minutes, I am going to show you exactly how Britain bankrupted itself, how the United States ruthlessly replaced Britain as the dominant power, and why Britain's collapse is the single most important case study for understanding what is happening to the American economy today. Because Britain's empire didn't end by choice. It ended because the money ran out. After World War I, the British Empire reached its statistical peak. In 1920, it covered nearly 14 million square miles. That is nearly a quarter of the Earth's entire landmass. It ruled over 450 million people. With territories on every single continent, it was truly the empire on which the sun never set. But territory wasn't Britain's real power, money was. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. International trade was conducted in pounds. Entire countries held pounds in their national savings accounts. The City of London was the undisputed financial capital of the world. Britain was the world's largest creditor nation. British banks financed projects globally. British investors owned railroads in Argentina, mines in South Africa, tea plantations in India, and heavy industries on 6 continents. This financial dominance meant Britain could borrow money at the lowest interest rates in the world. This allowed it to fund its massive military cheaply and finance its colonial administration through debt. It could control global trade because it controlled the currency and the credit. The system was built on the gold standard. The pound was backed by physical gold at a fixed rate. This wasn't just a number on a ledger. It meant the pound had real, tangible value. You could walk into a bank and exchange your paper pounds for actual gold. This made the currency trustworthy and is the reason it became the world's reserve. Now, Britain's economy wasn't the absolute largest at this point. The US had already surpassed it in raw output. But for an island nation of only 44 million people, its influence was enormous. British coal, steel, textiles, and machinery powered the modern world. And underpinning all of this was the Royal Navy, still the largest and most powerful fleet on the planet. In 1920, Britain looked invincible. But financially, the cracks were already starting to show. The first major blow was World War I. From 1914 to 1918, the war cost Britain roughly £35 billion. Now that number might not sound huge today, but relative to Britain's economy at the time, it was catastrophic. To put it in perspective, Britain's entire GDP in 1914 was about £2.5 billion. The war cost 14 times Britain's annual economic output. So, where did all this money come from? First, taxation. Britain raised taxes dramatically. Income tax, which was practically zero for most people before the war, skyrocketed to as high as 30%. But even these crushing taxes couldn't cover the immense costs. So the second method was borrowing. Britain borrowed heavily from its own citizens through war bonds. But crucially, it also borrowed massive sums from the United States. For the first time in history, Britain became a net debtor to the US. By 1918, Britain's national debt had exploded from £650 million to over £7.4 billion. That is an 11-fold increase in just 4 years. The third method was selling assets. To pay for weapons and supplies, Britain was forced to sell off its foreign investments. Before the war, it owned vast assets overseas. After the war, a huge chunk of that wealth had been liquidated. There was also a currency problem. In 1914, Britain left the gold standard so it could print money to fund the war. The pound, which had been as good as gold for centuries, was suddenly just paper. They tried to go back to the gold standard in 1925 at the old pre-war rate. But this was a huge mistake. The pound was now massively overvalued, making British exports expensive and uncompetitive. This decision choked the British economy, causing deflation and high unemployment throughout the 1920s. The damage was done, but it was hidden. Britain had gone from being the world's largest creditor to a major debtor. The United States had gone from a debtor to a creditor. The global financial balance of power had fundamentally shifted, but most people didn't realize it yet. On the surface, Britain looked like it still ruled the world, but financially, it was hanging on by a thread. If World War I was expensive, World War II was the final catastrophic blow. The Second War cost Britain another £28 billion. But again, the absolute number doesn't tell the story. Relative to its shattered economy, this was an impossible burden. Britain fought World War II through total mobilization. At the war's peak, an incredible 55% of the entire country's GDP was dedicated to military spending. Essentially, the entire economy was devoted to the war effort. Food, fuel, and clothing were strictly rationed. Every single resource was directed toward one goal: survival. This was completely unsustainable. Britain was burning through its remaining wealth, selling off assets and borrowing at a rate that would bankrupt any nation. By 1941, Britain was on the verge of collapse. That's when the United States stepped in with the Lend-Lease program. The U.S. would lend Britain weapons, food, and supplies, which Britain would repay after the war. But this was not charity. The U.S. charged interest, and in exchange for this lifeline, Britain had to agree to American terms. These terms included dismantling the trade preferences within the British Empire, opening up the empire to American trade and investment, and accepting American financial oversight. In essence, Britain was trading its empire for survival. The United States was buying global dominance at a discount. The result was a debt explosion. By 1945, Britain's national debt was 250% of its GDP. Let me repeat that. The debt was 2.5 times larger than the entire British economy. For comparison, U.S. debt today is around 123% of GDP. Greece, at the worst of its debt crisis, peaked at 180%. Britain in 1945 was in a league of its own. It was catastrophic. To service this debt, Britain had to sell everything that wasn't nailed down. Foreign investments were liquidated. Gold reserves were depleted. Overseas holdings, art, buildings, anything of value was sold off. By 1945, Britain had completed its transformation from the world's largest creditor nation to the world's largest debtor nation. It took just 30 years and 2 world wars. Britain was now completely dependent on America. It owed the United States over $4.3 billion from 1945, which sounds small but was a crushing burden on a shattered economy. Britain depended on American loans just to survive, to feed its people. While the war was still raging, the U.S. and Britain met at Bretton Woods to design the post-war financial system. Britain, represented by the brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes, proposed a new neutral international currency. But the U.S., represented by Harry Dexter White, had a different idea. They wanted the dollar to be the new reserve currency backed by gold at $35 an ounce. Britain, bankrupt from 2 world wars, was in no position to argue. The U.S. held all the cards, and so the dollar replaced the British pound. This wasn't just a technical change. It was the single most important transfer of power in the 20th century. What does it mean to be the reserve currency? It means everyone needs your money to trade. It creates constant global demand for your currency. It means you can run huge trade deficits indefinitely because the world needs your dollars. You can borrow at the lowest rates, and your financial sector dominates the globe. For 200 years, Britain enjoyed these incredible advantages. Overnight, they were handed to the United States. Immediately, the crisis for the British pound began. Britain tried to maintain the pound's value after the war, but the fundamentals were broken. Their national debt was 250% of GDP. Their economy was shattered. They were running massive trade deficits, and the dollar was now king. The pound was massively overvalued, and everyone knew it. But to admit this was to admit that Britain was no longer a great power. The first humiliation came in 1949. Britain was forced to devalue the pound by 30%, from $4.03 down to $2.80. Great powers don't devalue their currencies. But even this didn't solve the real problem. Britain could simply no longer afford its empire. Think about the cost. Maintaining an empire meant military garrisons across the globe, a naval presence in every ocean, vast colonial administrations, infrastructure investments, and constantly fighting independence movements. Britain's economy was half the size of America's, but it was trying to maintain a global footprint that the math just didn't support. The breaking point, the moment the world saw the emperor had no clothes, was the Suez Crisis of 1956. Egypt's leader Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital artery for shipping, especially oil from the Middle East. Britain, which owned 44% of the canal company, was not about to let this stand. Along with France and Israel, they launched a military operation to retake the canal. Militarily, it was a success. Within days, British and French forces occupied the canal zone. But then, the United States stepped in. President Eisenhower was furious. He opposed the operation and threatened to bring Britain to its knees, not with bombs, but with finance. The U.S. threatened economic sanctions, cutting off oil supplies and, most critically, selling its vast holdings of British pounds. This would have crashed the currency. America also blocked the emergency loans Britain desperately needed from the International Monetary Fund. It was financial blackmail. Britain's foreign reserves were draining away. The pound was collapsing. The U.S. delivered a clear ultimatum: withdraw from Suez or face total financial ruin. Britain had no choice. Despite their military victory, they withdrew in complete humiliation. The Suez Crisis revealed the New World Order. British military power meant nothing without American financial approval. The empire was a facade, and the U.S. was now pulling the strings. Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned in disgrace. The pound came under renewed attack, and across the empire, independence movements saw that Britain was weak, accelerating their push for freedom. Suez didn't cause the end of the empire, but it made its end undeniable and irreversible. The decline continued. In 1967, Britain devalued the pound again, another 14% cut. The Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, went on television and famously told the British people that the pound in your pocket hadn't been devalued. It was a lie, and a desperate one. This was the second major devaluation in less than 20 years. Why did this keep happening? Britain was stuck in a cycle of consuming more than it produced, running trade deficit after trade deficit. When you have the reserve currency, you can get away with this. But Britain didn't anymore. It had to pay for its imports with foreign currency, and it was constantly running out. The Bank of England would try to defend the pound by selling its reserves and jacking up interest rates, but it was a losing battle. Devaluation was always inevitable. Through the 1960s and 70s, Britain became known as the sick man of Europe. The country was crippled by stagflation, that's high inflation, and a stagnant economy. Strikes paralyzed industry. The energy crisis made everything worse. Manufacturing collapsed, and a brain drain saw Britain's best and brightest leave for America. The nation that had been the wealthiest on Earth just 50 years prior was now in a state of managed decline. The ultimate humiliation came in 1976. Facing another currency collapse, Britain had to go cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund, an organization it had helped create, and beg for a bailout. The IMF agreed, but with harsh conditions: cut government spending, raise interest rates, and implement austerity. The nation that once ruled a quarter of the world was now taking orders from international bureaucrats. During this period, Britain rapidly liquidated its empire. India and Pakistan in 1947, Malaysia in 1957. Most African colonies in the 60s until the last major possession, Hong Kong, was handed over in 1997. The official story was one of moral enlightenment, of gracefully granting independence. The reality was that Britain was bankrupt. Every colony was a drain on the treasury. The empire had to go because the bills could no longer be paid. So what's the lesson here? Britain's collapse followed a clear pattern. First, massive debt from wars. Second, the loss of reserve currency status. Third, persistent deficits from consuming more than you produce. Fourth, repeated currency devaluations. Fifth, becoming dependent on foreign creditors. And finally, the loss of political independence and the forced liquidation of assets. Now look at the United States today. Debt accumulation? We're at $35 trillion and counting from endless wars and spending. A decline in the dollar's reserve status? It's slow, but it's happening. Persistent trade deficits? Check. Currency pressure? The dollar has lost over 86% of its purchasing power since 1971. Rising debt costs? Interest payments on the national debt now exceed the entire defense budget. Growing constraints on our actions? Absolutely. The final stage for Britain was empire liquidation. The terrifying question for America is, what do we liquidate? The critical difference is speed. It took Britain about 30 years to go from the dominant global empire to an IMF bailout case. In today's hyper-fast, interconnected financial world, what took Britain 3 decades could take America half that time if the trajectory continues. The warning from history is stark. Britain didn't choose to end its empire. It was forced to by financial reality. Empires don't end because of moral progress. They end because they go broke. Financial power is the only real power. Military strength is meaningless if you can't afford to sustain it. And having the world's reserve currency is the ultimate superpower. Britain learned this the hard way. America may be next,